A Gododdin is an epic early medieval Welsh poem detailing the heroic warriors who fought and died at a battle believed to have taken place at Catterick in Yorkshire. This poem gives us a fascinating insight into society at the time, and so this video is a deep literary dive into the poem to explore what makes it so great. So join me as we look at this part of Yorkshire's hidden history. The poem is set in the Hen Ogledd, the Welsh word for an area of northern England and lowland Scotland which was inhabited by the Celts after the Romans. A variety of groups from north and mainland Europe, known as the Anglo-Saxons, soon settled and invaded, eventually establishing various kingdoms. The most important ones for us are Bernicia and Deira. The poem tells us that the ruler of Gododdin gathered together around 300 warriors from all over Wales on the Hen Ogledd and, after feasting in Edinburgh for a year, embarked on a disastrous campaign against Bernicia and Deira, in which almost everyone was killed. The generally accepted period in which the battle took place is around 600. If so, it's likely to have happened before 638, as that's when Edinburgh fell to the Angles, followed by the Kingdom of Gododdin, which was incorporated into Bernicia. The format of the poem is essentially a series of 97 stanzas, each eulogising an individual or group of people. It's not a narrative or a story like the Odyssey or the Iliad, rather it's a series of memorials to these warriors. So for these individual eulogies we have, for example, stanzas 29 and 57. Ceredig, amiable leader, a wrestler in the impetuous fight. His golden shield dazzled the field of battle. His lances, when darted, were shivered into splinters, and the stroke of his sword was fierce and penetrating. Like a hero would he maintain his post. Before he received the affliction of earth, before the fatal blow, he had fulfilled his duty in guarding his station. May he find a complete reception with the Trinity in perfect unity. Of those whom I have seen, or shall hereafter see, on earth engaged in arms, the battle cry and war, the most heroic was he, who slew the mounted ravagers with the keenest blade. Like rushes did they fall before his hand. O son of Clydno, of lasting fame, I will sing to thee a song of praise, without beginning, without end. And ones dedicated to groups, such as stanza 18. From Aedhin, arrayed in golden armour, 3 loricated hosts, with 3 kings wearing the golden torques, 3 bold knights, with 300 of equal quality, 3 of the same order, mutually jealous, bitterly would they chase the foe, 3 dreadful in the toil, they would kill a lion flat as lead. So we can see how the individuals are memorialised in the poem, their lives and deeds preserved for future generations. The intention isn't to tell the story of the battle, it's to remember these warriors and what they did. The bard is at pains, for example, in stanza 30, to name 4 witnesses to his description of Caradog. He cares about showing that the way he's described these warriors is accurate. However, he does take some poetic license. He describes 300 warriors, but this likely refers to 300 chieftains who would control their own band of warriors, as they own a lot of expensive horses and armour which only someone of their status could afford. He also says that the Anglo-Saxons had over 50,000 warriors. Now, 300 versus 50,000, well, either he's overestimating how many warriors the Anglo-Saxons had, or he's not telling us how many warriors the Gododdins had. Throughout the poem we get many beautiful descriptions of the weapons, armour and clothes worn by these warriors. If we look at stanzas 1 and 4, for example, we read, Fleet, thick-maned chargers were ridden by the illustrious hero. A shield, light and broad, hung on the flank of his swift and slender steed. His sword was blue and gleaming, his spurs were of gold, his raiment was woolen. Adorned with a wreath was the leader, the wolf of the home. Amber beads in ringlets encircled his temples. Precious was the amber, worth a banquet of wine. These lines really conjure up images of these warriors. We can picture them in our head when we read them. Another recurring feature are allusions to Christianity. We read in stanzas 5, 6, 12 and 42, he sooner became the raven's prey than approached the altar. They should have gone to churches to do penance. The gem of baptism was thus widely taunted. None of the houses or cities of Christians was any longer actively engaged in war, at the hour of matins. So we can see then in the bard's mind that this battle has a religious significance, regardless of its real cause, whether it was land or power. For the bard, he's felt that this battle between some Christians and an army of largely pagans is meaningful and worthy to keep in the poem. Now, some have tried to argue that these Christian references are a later addition. However, I find this quite unlikely. We know that there was Christianity in Britain at this time. We have references to martyrs as early as the 3rd century. The first Archbishop of Canterbury was in 597, so it's not as though there was no Christianity at this time. I will concede, however, that references to matins probably are a later addition, as these are a type of set prayers used mostly in monasteries, which, though some were established at this time, came a little bit later. Like the Odyssey and other epic poems, there's a lot of recurring phrases which appear throughout the poem. One of the reasons for this is simply because, as a poem composed and transmitted orally, it's a lot easier to remember if you recycle phrases. So the phrase, "the heroes march to Catraeth," and its subsequent variations appear in stanzas 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 and 21. It's an extremely common phrase. We also see the inevitable strife of death was about to pierce them, and they should have gone to churches to perform penance in stanzas 6 and 8. If you haven't guessed so already, there's a number of references to mead and drinking. Heroes marched to Catraeth filled with mead and drunk. Mead they drank, yellow, sweet and snaring. Together they drank the bright mead by the light of torches. Though pleasant to the taste, it proved a lasting foe. Short-lived were they, they'd become drunk over the distilled mead. Naturally, this makes us think that the warriors are all drunk, and indeed that was a position taken in the past, but recent scholars have argued, by looking at similar poetry from the period, that the term mead was also used to include basically anything given to the warriors by their lord, not just the drink. I think, and this is just my interpretation, that the bard didn't intend for us to think that they were actually drunk in battle. It wouldn't make any sense for hardened veteran warriors to all be drunk in battle, as this would reduce their effectiveness. Rather, I think the bard is deliberately referring to the year spent feasting and drinking in Edinburgh, because if you're spending that much time in that place, you're probably preparing for this campaign, you're organising, you're working out what you're going to do. And whether he literally means that the alcohol made them think that they could win this battle and take on this army, or whether it's more of a figure of speech, I think the bard is trying to tell us that it was that time spent feasting which led them to believe that they could win this battle, which ultimately led to their downfall. It's why we read in stanza 15, "though pleasant to the taste, it proved a lasting foe." But that's just my interpretation. You might be wondering at this point how we actually know that it took place at Catterick. As you may or may not be aware, I'm not the type of person to just regurgitate something I read without investigating it for myself. Well, Catterick was a very important place. It was a site of a Roman fort and settlement named Catterick and stood by the River Swale. Sitting on the site of the major Roman road Deer Street, which ran through York to London and up to Hadrian's Wall, it was a strategically important place, especially as it was basically slap bang in the middle of Hen Ogledd and the various kingdoms. Catterick is the most widely accepted location, and there's no reasonable doubt as to why the Catraeth in the poem is not Catterick. What may or may not be relevant, but which I think is worth mentioning, is that Catterick became a major hub for Christian conversion. St Paulinus, we are told, performed mass baptisms in the River Swale at Catterick between 627 and 633, which fits into the time frame for the battle and also demonstrates just how important this place was. But back to the poem. Another interesting thing which this bard does is contrast the martial or military lives of the warriors with the domestic ones. I think a really good example is stanza 88. Unflinching eagle of the forward heroes, he bore the toil, and brilliant was his zeal. The fleetest coursers he outstripped in war, but was quite a lamb when the wine from the goblet flowed. So this is great, because in battle he's this ferocious, brilliant warrior, but when he's just having a drink, he's quiet and shy like a little lamb. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is Arthur. Can you guess what I'm on about? Yes, King Arthur. You see, there is a single fleeting reference in the poem to an individual named Arthur, and naturally, like a big fish story, people have extrapolated from this that this is the earliest reference to the King Arthur. As you can tell, I'm not really a big fan of this. To me, it's like digging up a Bronze Age palace in Sparta and announcing that you've found King Menelaus from the Odyssey. Well, no, you haven't, because Menelaus is largely a mythological construction in the Odyssey and probably bears little to no resemblance to whatever individual he may have been based on in real life. So I'm not going to dwell too much on Arthur. Let's look at the actual composition of the poem. This is a source of considerable debate, with estimates ranging from the 6th to the 10th centuries, and really there's no consensus on when it was composed. It all comes down to a lot of linguistic analysis. But an argument that I find particularly convincing for an early composition date is that a lot of the warriors mentioned in the poem don't appear again in later Welsh sources. So, if the poem was composed in the 9th century, for example, you'd expect that these warriors would appear in other 9th century works, but they don't. It suggests that at one time, perhaps in the 6th or 7th centuries, these people were famous, but later were forgotten, which supports the idea for an earlier composition date. The earliest surviving written manuscript is believed to date from the 13th century. Called the Book of Aneurin, after the alleged author of the poem, it is believed to have been compiled from 2 different sources by 2 different writers at a monastery, named Scribe A and Scribe B. Scribe A wrote 88 stanzas in Middle Welsh from one source, whilst Scribe B used an older source to write 35 stanzas in Old Welsh. Some of his stanzas are just variants on Scribe A's. Stanzas 59 and 60, for example, are clearly just saying the same thing. A number of stanzas are believed to be later additions to the poem because they're either irrelevant to the main topic or have a number of stylistic, structural or content differences to the rest of the stanzas. It's believed that these got accidentally mixed in with the main poem when it was copied out, or was just added later by different bards. Okay, so that's all very interesting, but who actually composed it? Well, it's attributed to the bard Aneurin. Now, there's a lot of rumours about who Aneurin was and his connection to various people and places, like the famous poet Gildas, but to be honest, with this period being notoriously murky and lacking in good historical sources, I find it more romantic if we view him as this mysterious, ineffable bard, a la Homer. Similarly, it's likely that the poem went under considerable group composition, that different bards who were retelling it added their own bits through the centuries. It's not like a novel where one person is responsible for the entire stories. Similar again to Homer. So there we have it, a Gododdin. But the story doesn't end there. We hear faint whispers and traces of the men of Catraeth in other Welsh poetry, such as by the famed Taliesin, and so important was Aneurin and his work culturally that he was given the title King of the Bards, and in the 13th century David Benfras prayed that he would be given the genius of Aneurin. It's important to remember as we close that this isn't just a poem, it's a memorial to these heroic warriors. The intention of this poem was so that these warriors could be remembered, and the fact that we're talking about them to this day, well, it's done exactly that. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've learned a lot. To please the cruel mistress, which is the YouTube algorithm, it'd be really appreciated if you could like, subscribe to keep updated. See you next time.